I absolutely would not tell any child that racial differences were significant, and for exactly the same reasons you put forward. The differences are superficial, and the similarities are far more important.
So Martin J. Willett starts off his video by re-articulating popular dogmas about racial variation, that it is merely superficial, it is not important, and it shouldn't be taught to children. I would suggest an alternative approach that neither overemphasizes racial differences nor denies that they exist except at the superficial level. I would suggest that the question we should be asking is not how do we shield children from learning about these differences, but how do we present these differences to children in a way that will not foster hatred or other irrational bigotries directed against particular groups. That is a valid concern, and it is worth emphasizing that there are core similarities among all humans that logically suggest that we have the same basic natures. There's just variations in how that nature is expressed in certain areas, but we have the same basic natures and the same basic rights and should be given the same basic respect as human beings. That all follows from observations rooted in realities of race.
Why does anybody need this to be continually restated? I am not a racist or a so-called race realist either.
Why would you even take the charge of "you're racist" seriously enough to issue a formal denial? I mean, racist charges have become so farcical that the only appropriate response I can think of to them is to laugh them off, to parody them, because there's no content anymore to the charge of racism. There's nothing to respond to. Then you go further and you deny that you are a race realist. At the same time, you purport to be attacking what you call race surrealism. So you seem to want to position yourself into some kind of middle ground between those who advocate totally made-up views on race and those who advocate rigidly reality-oriented views on race. To me, a race realist is one whose views on race are derived from objective observations of reality and not biased by social pressures or ideological commitments, whether it's racial egalitarian ideology or racial supremacist ideology. Now, I would insist on some substantive content to the concept of race realism, and that would be that the observable aggregate differences we see among the races in terms of intelligence and other characteristics are largely explainable by genetic differences. So that would exclude the pure egalitarians who believe that everybody is inherently equal in all capacities and that all variation is explained by environment. Those people could not be race realists as far as I'm concerned. In the same way that somebody who was an atheist and described himself as a free thinker would insist that religious cult members could not describe themselves as free thinkers, even though some would like to, because the views of a religious cult member are entirely incompatible with the concept of free thinking.
I do not believe that racial differences have been proven not to exist. The reason for that is that the amount of difference in politically sensitive measures, such as intelligence, is clearly relatively small.
Earlier you claimed that racial differences were superficial. That's not the same thing as saying that racial differences are relatively small. You can have a superficial difference, such as skin shade, that exhibits itself in relatively significant ways, in very stark ways, such as the skin tone of a Nordic white versus that of a sub-Saharan African. The sub-Saharan African may not be totally, completely pitch black, and the Nordic European may not be completely, entirely pale white, but the differences between the two are nearly as large. Now, it is not entirely clear that racial differences in intelligence are relatively small. You could argue that they are, but it gets down to the question of, well, relative to what? Are the differences in average intelligence levels observed between Ashkenazi Jews and Australian Aborigines large compared to the differences between the whole human species and other species? Well, maybe not. But are the differences between Australian Aborigines and other races, say Ashkenazi Jews, white Europeans, Japanese, Chinese, are those differences important enough to call into question the very existence of civilization as we know it? In other words, if the entire world had been populated by Australian Aborigines, would it be conceivable that we may not have what we take for granted now? We may not have the electronic communications over which we are communicating. We may not have cities. We may not have automobiles. We might all be living a very primitive existence. Of course, this is just speculation. I can't prove that Australian Aborigines wouldn't have come up with the inventions that members of other races have come up with had Australian Aborigines been more numerous throughout the world. But it is nevertheless an important question. If racial differences in intelligence come down to the difference between life as we know it today and life as we knew it 4,000 years ago, then at the very least we can say that even if racial differences in intelligence are relatively small, they can have relatively large consequences for societies.
What we do see in human history is entirely consistent with human populations being broadly equal or varying within very small bands.
Broadly equal? That strikes me as an injection of race equalitarian surrealism. When looking over the course of the history of human civilizations, you find some similarities, yes, but equality? No, I don't think so. And we know that race has something to do with it because we see that when different races exist in the same society, there is a very predictable and very consistent ordering of aggregates in terms of intelligence, terms of incomes, terms of crime rates, and other factors that are very important in the development of civilizations.
People are assumed to be too stupid to be able to handle the truth, so a useful myth is created instead.
As in, racial variation is only superficial, or all human populations are broadly equal.
Race is a social construct, but it is based on real biological variation.
Well, there you go. You've now parroted just about all of the main points of the race equalitarian surrealists. So, congratulations. You're one of them.
Arbitrary social construct, arbitrary social construct, arbitrary social construct.
Social constructivism is the destruction of concepts. And I don't care if you think that your social constructs are based on observations of reality. The fact that you call race a social construct tells me that you're leaving it up entirely to social evaluation of the reality that you are perfectly capable of observing for yourself. Any one individual could go around and observe the variation among human populations around the world and come up with the concept of race on his or her own. The whole point of the language of social construction is to detach concepts from reality and make them dependent entirely on a social evaluation. So your attempt to link, in some sense, a social construction with reality is entirely arbitrary, because somebody else who also believes that race is a social construct will say that we're going to construct race as being an egalitarian concept, and we're going to deconstruct somebody else's construct of race as being different in any way. It's all a bunch of nonsense, and you're right in the thick of it. You've chosen not to extricate yourself from the nonsense. You are so bothered by and fearful of accusations of racism that you want to position yourself in the accuser's camp.
Human equality is another human construct, not a scientifically proven fact.
Human equality is not an observable or scientifically provable fact of reality. Race and racial variation are observable and scientifically provable facts of reality. Is the human species itself a scientifically unproven human construct? Or are only the subdivisions within the human species human constructs? You know, did it ever occur to you to make the distinction between the biologically produced and the socially evaluated? Meaning that the human species and all manifestations within it are the result of biological processes, and our evaluations about how different types of humans should interact with each other. For example, notions that we should all treat each other equally, or that one type of human is superior to another type of human. You know, those are things that can't be proven scientifically. Those are normative evaluations.
Arbitrary social constructs, 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 arbitrary social constructs.
Everything is a social construct. If race is a social construct, then so is species. If species is a social construct, then so are molecules and atoms and quarks. Why do you join those who insist on calling race and only race a social construct? Why don't you ever call birds or trees or rocks or stars social constructs? When there's debate among people over some aspect of birds or trees or rocks or stars, and one side makes a claim about them that the other side rejects, why doesn't one side just say, well, what we're talking about here is a social construct? So your attempt to say that your position is rooted in observable reality isn't sufficient. After all, a social construct is constructed by the opinions of people. And if we're only arguing over opinions, then of what importance is reality, or that your views correspond to it?
Humanity is not equal. Nature simply doesn't do equal. Nature does strong and fast and smart, but not equally strong, equally fast, or equally smart.
Unless we're talking about human history, in which case all populations have to be broadly equal, because to believe otherwise might be construed as racist, or something like that.
Faking evidence and destroying categories so that inequality can never be demonstrated is childish, smashing the theories of races and scattering its ashes, dismissing the concept of intelligence, making out that IQ measurements are no more scientific than horoscopes, are all aspects of what I call race surrealism.
You've done a pretty good job of identifying an irrational approach to race. The antidote to it is not to muddy the waters by trying to reform certain aspects of race surrealism. The antidote to race surrealism is unapologetic, unadulterated race realism.